It is a pleasure to be here. The Overcome team are fantastic. So no doubt whether you've already had support from them or it's your first time joining, yeah, Overcome's a fantastic charity that I've had the privilege to work with in the past as well. So without further ado, thank you for introducing me. I'm very lucky to be working in the oncology and women's health space. It's been a really big interest of mine for a really long time. And so I did my further studies and my professional development in this area, ended up in oncology, general oncology, and then moved around between stem cells to different oncology specializations before I landed on gynecology, which is where my heart is at as well. So menopause. This is the big topic, and it is an inevitable part of every single woman's journey. So it's really important that we get quite familiar with it, because regardless of if you're in your earlier stages of life or later, we all need to know what to expect. So let's talk about nutrition, myths, and more. No doubt there's lots of questions, so we'll also have some time at the end to answer any questions that I might not have covered through this presentation. Whenever you're ready is. Thank you. So this presentation will hopefully help you understand how menopause affects the body. So what exactly it is, why is menopause a thing, learn nutrition strategies to support health in this stage of life, and debunk some common myths. No doubt the internet and friends and family have lots of different bits of information that can be quite confusing and overwhelming to navigate. And some practical and realistic tips and some resources and places to point you to. So let's get started. What is menopause? This is a very busy slide, but we're going to go through it one by one. Menopause is a natural biological process that marks the end of a woman's menstrual cycle. Really important just to look at that sentence. Menopause is quite literally when you are no longer menstruating. That's what tells us that you are in menopause. Now, menopause comes in a few different stages, and we're going to talk about that as well. It's officially, though, diagnosed after 12 consecutive months without a menstrual period. That's really important. And it typically occurs between the ages of 45 and 55, but it can happen earlier or later. So some people have a very early menopause. Some people have a mechanical menopause. So that is when it's induced by, for example, a hysterectomy. Some women have to have their ovaries or their other organs removed, and that can induce a menopause that they may or may not expect. And sometimes it can happen naturally as well. Sometimes it can be drug related. Sometimes drugs can also induce it, or it can induce a pseudo-menopause for whatever reason. For example, some women have fibroids and they need to go through some medication therapy in order to thin down their uterus in order to have a procedure where they are essentially removing those fibroids. If fibroids is not something that you've heard of, that's okay. We're not talking about it in this session per se, just to kind of put things into place about what menopause can look like and how and what can induce it. So the stages of menopause, there's the perimenopause stage, and that's the transition phase leading up to menopause. So that's when your periods do start to become irregular. You'll notice it within your own body. And then those symptoms of hot flushes to mood changes to irritability, etc., that's when they start to appear. Now, perimenopause can last for a very long time. It could be a few years or it could be some months, but generally speaking, everyone's bodies are quite different. But it could be anywhere from 2 up to 8, even 10 years of perimenopause. Menopause, though, is when it's been 12 consecutive months since your last period. So perimenopause can often have regular to irregular to regular to irregular periods until it's spaced out to an extent where you no longer have them. That's when you know you're in menopause. And then you have postmenopause, and that's the time after menopause. Lots of symptoms happen here, regardless of if you're in peri, menopause, or postmenopause. So some of the common ones that you might be familiar with, apologies, the presentation seems a little bit out of, I think the technical aspect is a little bit funny at the moment, but I hope you can see it well. So the hot flashes is perhaps the most significant one, but there are other ones like night sweats. Your mood can often change. You can become a little bit more irritable. Vaginal dryness is a very big one, and we'll talk about strategies for all of these. Reduced libido is an understandable outcome as well. And weight gain and metabolism shifts. So you'll find that you can gain weight quite quickly with food and diet that you were perhaps not so sensitive to before. These are some really common ones. Now, really important as well, I just want to show you that research actually does suggest that Black, Asian, and Latina women and Swana women begin the transition to menopause actually a lot sooner than white women. And that is an accumulation of genes, access to health resources, social aspects, age that you may or may not have pregnancy, etc. There's lots of things that come into play here, but it's really important just to note that there are actually some big differences, and a lot of this is going to be an indicator about when to access some medical support. And oftentimes we do find that those in a minority group find it harder to access health support as well. So it's really important to sort of break that barrier, and there's lots of groups doing work there as well. Okay, when you're ready. So hormone changes and what this means for your body. Now, essentially, when your periods stop, you know that you no longer have the right, or not necessarily, right's not the right word, you don't have the same hormonal ingredients that you had before. Because ultimately, what does menstruation mean? It means your body is trying to induce a pregnancy. And when it's unable to do that, it gets rid of the egg that it has sort of ovulated in order to become fertilized. Now, when time, of course, can induce this, but time will eliminate a lot of these eggs from your body because it is ovulated, it's not used, it means it's discarded by the body. After a certain amount of time, you don't have that many eggs. That's very normal. And so what happens? Your body starts to flush out the remaining eggs and says, okay, it's time to go into the next chapter of life. This is where estrogen plays a really central role because it's one of the primary hormones that regulate the menstrual cycle. It's really important that you have estrogen while you are going through menstruation, because that's the one that signals whether you ovulate or whether you menstruate. But when you no longer need this, then your body goes into estrogen deficiency. You no longer need estrogen to do what it did before. So the reproductive system and other functions in the body are all regulated by estrogen. It's not just your ovulation that it controls. And as you can see in the little picture that I put here, you've got estrogen receptors everywhere in the body. You've got it in the brain, you've got it in the pituitary, lungs, bone, breast, your cardiovascular system, so your heart, your liver, the gastrointestinal tract, your bladder, for men prostate, and for men testes, for women ovaries. So this is really important. It does have multiple receptor sites through the body. And as women approach menopause, the estrogen levels significantly decline. That's what leads to the symptoms leading to menopause. It's essentially your body saying, I'm deficient in this hormone that I had before, and it's trying to re-regulate itself and adjust to this new state of hormones. So it is really important to know how estrogen can affect other parts of your system as well. So it affects your metabolism, it affects your insulin sensitivity, your fat distribution. You'll find that oftentimes you'll have more abdominal fat and visceral fat. Visceral fat is the fat around your organs. You don't see this fat, but the fat around your organs is the one that we want to reduce more. But it's also the one that, because you don't have as much estrogen anymore, it does accumulate. So there's some other lifestyle strategies that's really important to do to reduce the amount of visceral fat you have stored in your body. Then you've got osteoporosis, bone and muscle mass. Again, you've got estrogen receptors in your bone. So when you no longer have estrogen, which is really important in maintaining strength in your bone and the structure within the bone, then you've got to do other lifestyle strategies and nutrition strategies to bring that strength back. And then the cardiovascular risk. Again, women are more likely to have hyperlipidemia, that's high cholesterol levels, cardiovascular disease, and other cardiovascular risks as well. And this is, again, very normal because the estrogen receptors that are on your heart are no longer getting that estrogen that was there before, and that was a protective mechanism for lots of these systems. But again, lots of lifestyle strategies that we can do in place of estrogen. When you're ready. Okay, so some core nutrition principles for menopause. Again, I apologize about the way that the slides look, but I can always send you the slides afterwards as well. So we're going to talk about 3 different things. We're going to talk about macronutrients, micronutrients, and hydration and alcohol. So 3 different things here specifically. For the first part, macronutrients. What are your macronutrients? These are your 3 essential nutrients that you need through your foods. They're the big food groups. You've got protein, you've got carbohydrates, and you've got fats. This is a very big conversation because you'll often find that somebody will eliminate one whole food group, for example, protein or carbohydrates or fats. And that is what we would consider a fad diet. And it's not a sustainable diet, but why are the macronutrients so important and how do we need to focus on it through menopause? That's the real question. So let's talk about that. The first one is protein. Now, we talked about how with menopause, you'll often find that your bone density decreases and you can have more brittle bones, you can lose strength, you can have higher levels of fat distributed through the body. Where does protein fit in all this? Protein is a really important macronutrient because what it does is when you eat protein, protein is kind of like the building blocks to your muscles. When you've got muscles, there's something that needs to happen in order to keep those muscles nice and active. Your muscles are essentially your metabolically active tissue. They have lots of different things going on in there that boosts your metabolism. So we need to maintain that protein, that muscle store. And we do that by giving our body protein so that we give it those building blocks to maintain that mass there. So if you don't have a lot of protein in your body and you've got a lot of muscle in your body, then over time you're going to lose muscle because you don't have the resources to maintain the muscle structures. So what protein does, again, building blocks. So you'll find that you are not building muscle per se, but you've got to maintain your muscle mass. So at the stage of menopause, your protein requirements shoot up from when you are perhaps at my stage of life. And that's because the body's ability to eat away at muscle, for lack of a better word, to degrade the muscle is actually faster than its ability to build muscle. So that means you've got to take more protein in to maintain the structures that you've got, let alone to build muscle if you're doing strength-based exercises. So what does this mean? It's important to think about protein at every meal and even snacks. It can come in big or small forms, but here are some principles to think about. We want to limit red meat to no more than 2 serves a week. Why? Red meat is usually quite high in saturated fats, and we already know that the risk of cardiovascular disease shoots up pretty significantly during menopause. If you have a lean version of red meat, it's much better, of course, but we still want to have no more than 2 serves a week because generally the guidelines suggest that high amounts of red meat in the diet can be associated with lots of different diseases, including cancer, and we want to limit that. It's ideal to focus on beans and pulses. In fact, only 5% of the UK population actually meets their pulse and legume requirements per day, which is really low. In fact, 40% don't have any pulses or legumes at all. And this is such an underrated nutrient because it's not just a protein, it's also a vegetable and it's also a fiber. And we know that all 3 of those things together are actually almost like the holy trinity of nutrition, because the fiber can also help to reduce your cholesterol levels. And I can talk about that in a moment too. Fatty fish is a really good one. Not all fat is created equal, and we'll talk about that in a moment, but fatty fish in particular have a really anti-inflammatory version of fat that's quite good for heart health. Then we've got white meats, so that includes your turkey and your chicken, and we've got meat alternatives, so whether that's yogurt or dairy, and sometimes mock meats, but in limited amounts because mock meats are still considered a processed food and we don't know enough and we want to limit processed food in general. And nuts are also really great as well, and seeds. Portion control is really important, but 2 to 3 serves of protein a day is what we would always recommend, and more if you are active. So what does a serve look like? Essentially, think about the palm of your hand for any meat-based protein, and think about a cup if it's not a meat-based protein, for example, yogurt or milk. Okay, carbohydrates. Not all carbs are created equal. Very important to remember this one. Carbohydrates are so important. It's my favorite macronutrient, personally. Carbohydrates come in lots of different forms. There's the simple form, and there's also a very processed little tail end from that is the very processed form of the simple carbohydrates. And then we have our whole grain carbohydrates, very different nutritionally. So when we think about our simple carbohydrates, we're talking about things that are like your white sugar or things that are quite easy for your body to digest. The tail end of the simple carbohydrates are things like your lollies or your soft drinks, things that are quite processed and nutritionally don't really do much for you outside of give you a big rush of sugar. Then you've got your whole grain carbohydrates, and this is a whole beautiful category. We're talking about wholemeal and sourdough breads, beautiful cereals, oats. I love rolled oats, pasta, potatoes with the skin on, brown rice, freekeh. Oh, it says freaked. It's meant to say freekeh. Bulgur, yam, and plantains. These are all fantastic sources of whole carbohydrates, whole grain carbohydrates. And the reason they're so great is because they've got a massive nutrient profile, including fiber. And fiber helps to bring down a lot of your cholesterol levels. In fact, it's perhaps the most important thing that you could do for your cholesterol levels, because it essentially binds, it looks like cholesterol in your body, but it doesn't function the same way. So it sort of binds to those cholesterol receptors and it stops your actual cholesterol from binding to it. And that's really important, especially given that our cholesterol rises quite significantly during menopause. Fats. The importance of omega-3s could not be underestimated. So omega-3s are found in fish. They're also found in other seafood, of course, but they are found in small amounts in dairy as well. They are found in quite limited amounts in the form that we want to find it in when it comes to our plant-based sources like chia seeds. It's not quite the active form that we want, but it's still a good form of omega-3s. This is really important because it's quite anti-inflammatory in the body, and we can talk about this buzzword in a moment as well. So aim for 2 portions of fatty fish per week, or at least 1 portion of that to be fatty, the other portion not necessarily. Fatty fish is salmon, mackerel, trout, sardines, anchovies, herring. These are all fantastic sources. Okay, let's go to the next one. And the next one is going to be micronutrients. So the 3 micronutrients, or the 3 here that I want to talk about: calcium, vitamin D, I've paired them together, magnesium, and iron. These 3 are probably the most important ones to think about right now. I've had to think about what's the most important, even though all of them are quite important. And also grab a pen and some paper as well. You'll also find this on YouTube later, but there's a lot of information here. So if it feels a bit overwhelming, just jot down your questions and I can always go through it again. So calcium and vitamin D are really important because these are what maintains your bone function. What happens during menopause is that you no longer have the estrogen that would otherwise keep that strength of bone. So you've got to do something else. You've got to go through diet and you've got to go through lifestyle and exercise to maintain good bone health. So throughout our life, we've got 2 important cells working in our bones, something called osteoblasts, and that creates bone quite quickly. And you've got something else called osteoclasts, and that eats away bone quite quickly. And they're both working together quite quickly. And throughout life, you'll find that the building bone or the building cells through your bone is working a little bit faster than the eating cells. And that happens until around about the age of 25 to 35. Then the cell that kind of wears away at the bone starts becoming more active. So over time, you start to lose bone. You start to resorb bone. We don't want that to be the case because it's it becomes a bit more significant during menopause. You no longer have that protective shield per se. So calcium and vitamin D become really quite important here. Calcium and vitamin D maintain the bone's strength so that it doesn't get absorbed back into the bloodstream. We want to keep it in the bones, the calcium in the bones. So studies show that women can lose actually up to 20% of their bone density in the first 5 to 7 years after menopause. That's quite a lot of bone density. Estrogen suppresses that activity of osteoclasts, like I mentioned. So what we do by giving our body vitamin D is we keep that calcium in the body. Now, our guidelines, national guidelines for vitamin D is quite low. It only says about 400 to 800 international units a day. This is much too low. The Women's Health Guidelines say 1,000 to 2,000 international units daily. So that's like a Boots vitamin D supplement. This could look like 2 to 3 portions a day of anything that is rich in calcium, which we'll talk about in the next slide. Milk, cheese, yogurt, dairy alternatives, these are all really great sources, but it's really important that we prioritize these. Magnesium is another really important one. It works together with the calcium and the vitamin D to keep your calcium in your bones, but it's also really important for sleep, mood, bone health, etc. Magnesium is something that you find in the soil. So mineral-rich soil can produce some mineral or magnesium-rich vegetables. Unfortunately, our food system is quite deficient in magnesium quite a bit. So we don't get the magnesium that we would otherwise have thought we would through our food supply anymore. So sometimes supplementing with magnesium could be quite helpful, but it's not necessarily the case. Some good dietary sources though, leafy greens. You must have your leafy greens daily, really important, I tell all my patients. Nuts, seeds, whole grains, beans, lentils, and dark chocolate. These are all really good sources of magnesium. And rather than thinking about these foods or these nutrition categories as separate from one another, you'll find that a lot of these foods cross over with one another. So you're getting your calcium and your magnesium, for example, from having your leafy greens, because calcium is in leafy greens as well. So you'll find that there's crossovers here, and same as iron. Now, iron, you've probably heard about this one quite a bit, because iron is the one that we lose most because it's in our blood. It's bound to our hemoglobin, which is our oxygen carrying capacity of our red blood cells. And when we're menstruating, we lose a lot of blood. And that's why during our menstruation years of our life, we have quite a high need for iron at about 18 milligrams per day. After menopause, you're no longer losing that blood. So it goes down to about 8 milligrams a day. So lots of postmenopausal women don't need to supplement iron because your requirements are no longer going to be high anymore, unless of course it's advised by a doctor. So often we say don't supplement at all. Okay, let's go to the next slide and we'll look at some high calcium and vitamin D sources of food. So like we said, vitamin D is really essential. It's not just calcium, you've also got something called phosphorus in your bones. And that's, again, to maintain that healthy bone structure. You've also got it in your teeth. Vitamin D is notoriously a big deficiency in the UK. It's obtained from direct sunlight. So what this means is you can eat lots of vitamin D sources like your yogurt and your eggs and your cheese. But while this is a really important nutrient, it doesn't become active until your skin is exposed to sunlight. That's from a dietary source. That's because when you eat the food version of vitamin D, you get something called vitamin D2. When you're exposed to the sun, it becomes the active version, which is actually a hormone called vitamin D3. That's what we want. All supplements are vitamin D3, but when it comes to dietary sources, this is something to consider. Now, throughout the winter years, it's nearly impossible to get vitamin D from the sun. So you're quite reliant on your exposure between April and September. If you're working a desk job, if you're indoors quite a bit, and especially if that's between 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. when the UV index is at its peak, you're probably not getting the right amount of sun exposure. So what I would say is, as a blanket, to always supplement with vitamin D. But here are some really good food sources regardless. So when it comes to vitamin D, on the right, we can see milk, cheese. Oh, pardon me. On the right is the calcium. On the left is the vitamin D. So we've got oily fish, cod liver oil, margarines, eggs, and breakfast cereals. These all have some really good amounts of vitamin D. As you can see here, it does talk about the lower end of your vitamin D requirements, so it really would not be enough from a dietary point of view, especially because your bone resorption levels are going to be a bit higher now. And when it comes to calcium, milk, cheese, yogurt, calcium-enriched milk alternatives, and anything that's calcium fortified. Sardines are also really great because sardines and fish that are quite pliable with their bones, you can eat the bones as well, so that's a really high amount of calcium. Some of these foods cross over, like the fish and the eggs, for example. Okay, I'm moving along quite quickly, so I do apologize if I'm being very quick, but I do want to get to your questions too. So let's talk about hydration and alcohol now. Really important because when it comes to hot flashes, dry skin, vaginal dryness, and some of the other things that you see here, like your digestive health, your joints, your muscles, and your urinary tract, hydration is really, really important. So generally speaking, we say you need about 30 to 35 mils of water per kilo of body weight that you are. So for example, I can't do the math on the top of my head, but if you're about 70 kilos, it would be around about 2 to 2.5 liters of water a day. So I might be wrong on the math side, but there's a bit of deviation there. Why? Now, it's really important because ultimately, when you're dehydrated, this will exacerbate your hot flashes and your night sweats. And you're losing a lot of water from your body from sweating. We lose quite a bit through just breathing, let alone through sweating. So we've got to replace that. It can exacerbate your dry skin and your vaginal dryness because menopause will thin the tissue or thin the lining of your vagina. And that means that you can be predisposed or prone to urinary tract infections, but also that sex might not be as comfortable anymore. Digestive health is also really important. A lot of the time, women who go through menopause will find that they're constipated. And when you're constipated, this can mean, this can be very uncomfortable, but this can mean that you're not having enough water. You need your water to push things along. So water becomes quite important here as well. And again, this is all regulated by hormones. That's the principle behind your hydration, but joint and muscle aches are also something that you can control with some water as well, because remember, your joints and your cartilage have a lot of water in there as well. What about alcohol? So the national guidelines here for alcohol is no more than 14 units a week. I think this is much too high. This amounts to something like 2 units a day for 7 days. And this means a glass of wine or a spirit. Now, at this stage of your life, it can become a challenge. We would say from a gynecological perspective, no more than 2 days per week of alcohol intake of 2 serves or standard drinks of alcohol. That's what we would normally recommend, or in 1 day, no more than 4 units. So that, again, could be a shot of a spirit, a glass of wine, or don't know if you use the word pot here, but a pint or pot of beer. Okay, so when it comes to alcohol, it can exacerbate your hot flashes and your night sweats because it does widen your blood vessels. It can disrupt sleep. It stops you from getting into a deep sleep, and that can irritate you even further because, again, estrogen is everywhere, including in your brain. And so that means that it can regulate some of those mood regulating hormones as well, or it can affect them. Mood and mental health, remembering that alcohol is a depressant. Weight gain, we know that alcohol increases the amount of weight that you hold in your body. It is empty calories, unfortunately. Nutritionally, it does really nothing for you, but it's extremely high in calories, so you do tend to hold on to it quite easily. Bone health, it doesn't do anything for bone health, unfortunately. And it does increase breast cancer risk because it does have some estrogenic activity. It does promote estrogen in the body. And remembering that you're now in a stage where you don't have a lot of estrogen in the body, you've got lots of other things to be thinking about now. So having something like a breast cancer risk on top of this is not something that would be the priority. Okay, let's talk about weight maintenance and weight loss and what this looks like for body composition. Not all bodies were created equal. I never want anybody to compare their body to somebody else's because it's not necessarily an indicator of your health. Being in a bigger body and being active and having a great diet is always going to be much better than being in a slimmer body, but being highly stressed, terrible sleep, not eating well, and not looking after yourself. Bodies and compositions don't necessarily equate to health, and not all bodies were created equal. So let's just remember that. Now, the principle does still stay here where we want some healthy lifestyle strategies in place, and we will talk about that again. We've touched on it just before. But generally speaking, as a blanket statement, we do want a balanced plate. If you're looking to maintain your weight, then we want the 1/3 portion of vegetables and fruit, lean proteins, and whole grain carbs. So for example, a plate could look like a slice of salmon with some frika or bulgur salad mixed with some vegetables. That would be a great weight maintenance bowl. If you are looking at weight loss, which is perfectly normal, especially if during menopause you do find that you've gained quite a bit of weight and it's unexpected, weight loss is always going to be quite healthy if you have an excessive amount of fat in the body. That's when we want to have half the bowl or half the plate be vegetables, a quarter to be your lean proteins, and a quarter to be healthy carbohydrates. And again, remembering that some of these foods can cross into both. For example, your legumes and your beans are both protein and carbohydrate and vegetable. So that would be a beautiful ingredient to include. It's really important to avoid extreme dieting. I can't emphasize this enough. It is never going to be sustainable. Extreme dieting is exhausting, and your metabolic system is very intelligent, but it can be very exhausted, especially at this new stage of life where menopause shifts so much of the balance in your body. Having an extreme diet on top of that, or a yo-yo diet, or cutting out a whole food group, or doing something like a ketogenic diet, or doing something like a low carb diet, or something else, can completely derail your metabolic system, because eventually, most of the time, we're unable to sustain that for a long time, and we end up putting on a lot more weight than we initially anticipated. Okay, strength training is the new focus. So when it comes to your body composition, let's remember now, it's much easier for your body to put on weight because you no longer have the estrogen circulating. Your diet could stay the same, but you're slowly putting on that weight. What do? You're slowly losing muscle, perhaps. Maybe it's things are just not working right. One way of bumping up your metabolic system is strength training. This now becomes the focus because, again, the other thing you could do to maintain your bone health is strength training. What happens with strength training is that your muscles are pulling at the bone. When it's pulling at the bone, it's kind of knocking on the door of your bones, and that stimulates your osteoblasts. If you remember that word, osteoblasts stimulate bone production. We want that. That's fantastic. So if you're constantly doing some strength training, then your muscles are constantly knocking at the door of your bones, and your osteoblasts wake up and it starts moving and it gets more active and it starts creating more bone. This is fantastic, especially given that women have upper body osteoporosis significantly more than men. All right, let's go to the next slide, which is about gut health, inflammation, and menopause. I'm just going to double check, ladies, did we have 1 hour here? Yep, okay, I might go through this one a bit quicker than before so that we can go to some really important slides that I definitely want to give enough attention to. Gut health, inflammation, and menopause is still a really important topic here. When it comes to hormonal fluctuations, again, remembering estrogen and progesterone, they're so important in the balance of all of your body systems, including your gut bacteria. And as these hormones go down, the gut microbiome can also shift. So what can happen is bloating or constipation, diarrhea. If you've heard of irritable bowel syndrome, lots of IBS-like symptoms. Increased inflammation, that includes illnesses and fatigue, and it slows your digestion time. So this can be a bit, what could this look like? This could look like your whole GI system, it can be affected, whether that is food stays in the tummy for longer, or cramps or diarrhea or constipation, just shifts in the gastrointestinal tract. And again, we touched on the slow metabolism and motility. We know that lower estrogen levels can reduce your gut motility, and that's how quickly your gut moves things along. That means some sluggish digestion, so it can make you feel quite heavy. What about the next one? And that's leaky gut and inflammation. Leaky gut used to be a bit of a fad term before, but new research has shown that actually there's some merit here. What this means is that your gut can be a little bit more permeable to moving things through that gut lining, and that can make your body quite susceptible to something we call inflammation. Inflammation is also a buzzword you might hear around quite often, but basically this is where your body is under stress. If your body's under stress, then your metabolic rate goes up and your body's ability to fight general colds or general infections or general things that it's exposed to day can go down. You can get sick a lot easier. And the gut-brain axis. Your gut and brain definitely communicate a lot. We can talk about this one in a whole presentation in and of itself. But what happens here is that your mood is already going to be affected by menopause. But when your gut hormones are also affected, it means that it can predispose you even more to anxiety, depression, brain fog, which is a really common one. And there's a big link between the gut and brain. The principle here is to have as colorful of a diet as possible. Eat the rainbow. There's a reason for this, because each color associated with plants is associated with a different antioxidant, and that feeds the gut directly. So that can look like probiotics, prebiotics, etc. And again, we'll definitely have time at the end for some questions. So I'll go to the next slide now so we have some more quality time on some really big myths and misconceptions. Okay, common myths and misconceptions. I would say raise your hand if you've heard of any of these, but at the moment, just raise your hand to yourself and then we can talk about who has heard of these myths before. Menopause causes inevitable weight gain. Is this a myth or is it a fact? It's kind of both. It can definitely cause weight gain, but it's not necessarily inevitable. So some of the things that we talked about before about vamping up the metabolic system, where the estrogen is no longer playing that protective role anymore, can help to alleviate some of those weight gain side effects of menopause. So again, the strength training, the diet, and just general lifestyle changes, whether that's stress management or sleep, they're going to be really important here. Number 2, soy is harmful because of phytoestrogens. We haven't actually talked about this one yet, but we're about to. The answer is actually no. Soy is not harmful because of phytoestrogens, but it does depend on the type and the source. Soy in and of itself is actually seen to be quite protective in Asian subgroups. So, for example, the Japanese diet is full of soy, and that is dietary versions of soy, not the supplements. And we find that their rates of gynecological cancers, for example, are quite low, and their symptoms like hot flushes are quite low when it comes to menopause. Soy is not necessarily a harmful product because of phytoestrogens. In fact, those phytoestrogens can be quite protective because it can bind to our receptor sites and prevent the estrogen from acting the way that it is normally acting if you have too much estrogen in the body. That's premenopause. But during menopause, it can kind of act like it can have an estrogenic stimulation activity so that your body doesn't feel like it's completely depleted and deficient of estrogen. So a little bit of good, but also it does depend on the source. If it's highly processed, like in mock meats, or if it's in a concentrated supplements, not necessarily very good for you because we just don't know. We honestly just don't know. The research isn't there. Most of the research behind this is in very high doses of phytoestrogens, or something we call isoflavones, which is the active component. And they're in petri dishes or they're in animal studies, and they're in amounts that humans wouldn't consume, and they're isolated. So can we really translate this to the human body? Not necessarily. But at the same time, we want to err on the side of caution, because when we don't know something, we don't necessarily promote it. We just say we don't know. You don't need to change your diet in menopause. Well, yes and no. If your body is particularly susceptible, then yes, you definitely need to start thinking about optimizing your protein And if weight management is something important to you, then definitely important to think about healthier principles when it comes to your diet. I should pick up running now that I'm in menopause. Not necessarily the case. In fact, strength training is the most important thing you could do from an exercise point of view, and that includes Pilates. Something like running, while it's really important for your heart health, is not the priority, even though it should play a really important part of your everyday diet. And if you enjoy it, then definitely do it. But if you already know that your bones are quite thin and that you have some cartilage thinning, then it's not necessarily the sport that's going to be the most beneficial for your body. But again, if you enjoy it and you're able to and you're capable, then absolutely go for it. Supplements can replace a healthy diet. We always know that that's not the case. Supplements are there to be supportive side kind of partners to the crime, not the actual, not the reason that your lifestyle is well balanced. It's just a little supplement, hence why it's not a replacement for diet. It's not called replacement, it's called supplement or partner. Hormone replacement therapy is always bad. Not the case. It is really important because everybody's bodies are different. Your predispositions, your family history, whether you're estrogen dominant, whether you have a history of high estrogen promoted cancers in your family history or anything like this is always going to play a part in whether hormone replacement therapy is right for you. But also the amount of time that you're on it is also something that you need to consider. So it's important that you have a really close relationship with your doctor because everybody's bodies are going to be different. Your friend or your mum or your sister's experience on HRT is not something that you can translate to your body, not at this stage. Okay, supplements. Let's talk about supplements because there's a lot of evidence versus fluff here. On the left side, we have supplements that we know are fine, can definitely supplement with, but you can also have dietary sources. On the right, we have supplements that we're not too sure about or that we don't necessarily promote. So on the left, we've talked about calcium and we've talked about vitamin D. So calcium, you can definitely get from your diet. Vitamin D, not necessarily something you can have in the amounts that you require through the diet. So I always recommend everybody to have a vitamin D supplement, especially in this country. Omega-3, DHA, and EPA. So have a look at the amount I've put there. I've said 1,000 milligrams daily. That's the recommended amount. One serving of fish has about 2,500 milligrams of omega-3. That's DHA and EPA, the functional active version of omega-3. So if you have 2 servings of fish a week, you don't need to supplement with an omega-3 supplement. If you're vegetarian, vegan, or otherwise, then it might be a really good idea to supplement with a vegan version of omega-3 as well, because it's generally really healthy for your body and all the systems we talked about, like your heart health and your cholesterol levels, etc. With your calcium, you have something called K2. K2 is another nutrient that helps bind calcium into the bones. You'll find K2 in a lot of fermented foods. That's something like natto, which is a fermented soybean, miso soup, sauerkraut, fermented cheese, egg yolks, and liver. These aren't always something that we have in our diets though. So sometimes supplementing calcium, vitamin D, and K2 can be quite effective as well. Linked with this one, we also have magnesium. I've written here magnesium glycinate or citrate. These are the forms of magnesium supplements that are quite helpful for the woman's body. And we've got the dosage there that is recommended as well. But again, you can get magnesium through your diet, through some of the dietary sources that we've discussed already. So you don't necessarily need to supplement with magnesium. Probiotics. If you have a probiotic in your diet, once daily or once every 2 days, this is more than sufficient for you. We've got lactobacillus and bifidobacterium. These are usually found in your fermented yogurts and cheeses and things like that. And even in your sauerkraut, miso soup, and kimchi. So if a live probiotic is not part of your day-to-day or every couple of days diet, then you might want to consider either having that through the diet or through a supplement, because this does help to regulate your hormones as well, and some of the other things that we've mentioned before. Collagen. Now, over time, you will find that, again, your bones, tendons, joints, ligaments, hair, and nail can be affected because your collagen is no longer as active as it was before. So supplementing orally, research has shown, can be quite helpful to maintain the integrity of your joint health and hair, skin, nails, etc. So you don't have to supplement it again, but it's something that you can safely do without worrying too much. There's 3 different types of collagen, type 1, 2, and 3. They do have different roles in the body. Type 1 was bone, tendon, ligament, hair, and nails. Type 2 was joint health, and type 3 is for wound healing. So have a look at your sources. If it's an animal-based source like bovine or marine, then they're the ones that are active. But if it's from a vegetarian source, generally speaking, outside of some gut health, gut happy action, it's not really going to do the function that an animal-based collagen would do. Okay, the fluff, or the last part here. So some of these supplements definitely go into the herbal medicine space, and it's really important to remember that everybody's bodies are different. So some of these, I'm going to say that they're okay, but you have to be really conscious because a lot of diseases can be severely affected by having a supplement like this. So for example, primrose, evening primrose. So something like 500 milligrams to 2000 milligrams a day can be seen to help with hot flushes. That's what our research shows. But it's absolutely not recommended in anybody that's had a history of seizures or who are on blood thinners. There is a bigger list. Those are the 2 biggest ones to keep in mind. So again, when I'm talking about the herbal supplement side of things, it can be a very dangerous territory because the recommendations should not be generalized. Everyone's bodies are different, and it's really important to talk to your healthcare provider and to cross-check your medications with the herbal supplements that you're considering long before you start taking it. But again, this is a general outline, general overview without talking about everything related to the herbal supplements. Black cohosh is another herbal supplement. It is again seen to help with hot flushes. You'll find that it'll be a dose of 20 to 40 milligrams a day. Really important if you've had any estrogen sensitive cancers in your life, that you don't take black cohosh. It's not safe, unfortunately, because it can stimulate estrogenic activity, and we don't want that to be the case. Also, any liver derangements, any liver problems in the history, something that we really need to be mindful of. Red clover, that is another herbal supplement that has an isoflavone or an estrogenic-like activity. Again, remembering that anything that's estrogenic tends to reduce the symptoms related to menopause. So it does bind weakly to those estrogenic receptors, and it can help to reduce those side effects. You can have that as a 40 to 80 milligram dose, but again, if you have a history of estrogen sensitivity, estrogen-related disorders, or an estrogen-positive cancer, absolutely not recommended. And it's absolutely contraindicated, I should mention as well. You can have it orally as a tea. That's important. A lot of these, while it's not safe in highly concentrated herbal doses, if you have it in the form of a tea or just in your day-to-day diet through a salad or something that would just be a normal dietary form, then it's very different to having a concentrated amount through a capsule. So it's much safer. Ashwagandha. Ashwagandha is one of the safe ones, generally speaking. It does tend to reduce your stress and it can improve sleep. You'll find that a 300 milligram dose bi-daily, so that means twice a day, can be quite helpful at reducing your stress levels, some hot flush symptoms, irritability, mood regulation, etc. And what we would say is if you have any history of an autoimmune condition, thyroid conditions, then this is probably going to be contraindicated because we don't know enough about it and it can affect your thyroids as well. But generally speaking, it has a lower list than the rest of things to be mindful of. Licorice fruit. This is another one that we're not really too sure about, but we do know that it's also phytoestrogenic. So supplementing 100 to about 300 milligrams a day can be considered safe unless you have a history of blood pressure, kidney function disorders, if you've gone through hormone therapy, or if you are currently going through HRT, something that would be contraindicated as well. Now, again, I've generalized a lot of this. Estrogen or estrogenic foods are not something to be afraid of, but everybody's bodies are different. And it's just something to be a lot more mindful of if you are estrogen positive or have a history of estrogen positive cancer in the past. Okay, our final takeaways. We've talked about estrogen receptors. They're everywhere in the body. Menopause is usually because of the deficiency of this very important hormone. Understanding why all the macronutrients are important is really essential in you taking some empowerment when it comes to your lifestyle choices. The micronutrients that we covered today are the ones that are particularly important when it comes to menopause. So that was your vitamin D, your magnesium, calcium, and iron. And hydration levels, maintaining adequate hydration helps with everything from sexual function to some of your other symptoms related to menopause. Alcohol, body composition, there's lots of ways of getting to your body composition goals. We've just talked about a few here, but there's a big list in our dietetic toolkit. So working with a dietitian is always really recommended. Gut health, we've glossed over this one a little bit, some common myths and some supplements. We've crossed over quite a bit here. Okay, thank you. So we have a little bit of time for questions. I've taken quite a bit of time up here, but I hope you've written any questions that you have. Now's the time, put them through, and our lovely Dolores and Iz will help read out some of these questions.
That was so informative. It's absolutely incredible. You've got such a huge amount of information. But I'll come straight to a question that we have in the Q&A. If anybody else has a question, please do drop it in. We will finish on time, but our questions after 7 o'clock, we will get those answered in written form anyway. So, question, should we be concerned about hormones in non-organic dairy products if we have an estrogen-sensitive cancer?
Really good question, and something that I get asked quite a bit by my own patients as well. Hormones that make their way into your dairy, it's not the same in terms of its function in the human body as you would anticipate it would work in a cow, for example. So they're very weak, and especially when you drink milk, the hormone doesn't make its way into the milk the way we anticipate, and the little bit of kind of estrogenic activity that it does have is not the same as some of the estrogenic foods that we've talked about earlier. Dairy is completely safe, and in fact, it's got something called butyric acid, which is very protective for your women in general. It's a very powerful antioxidant. It's also got vitamin D and calcium, which are really important. So the estrogen or the estrogenic profile that's often thought to be inside dairy products, it doesn't actually work that way at all. It's a big common myth, so you don't need to be worried about hormones making its way into dairy products.
Thank you. And we've probably just got for this one, we've just got one more. When it comes to fasting, is this a good thing to do, and what can this affect?
Look, really good question as well. Fasting is not necessarily something we would recommend. Depending on your body, there are some really positive research when it comes to fasting and what it can do for some people. But again, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. So what the principles are behind fasting is that when you have a very long, prolonged fast, like for example, a 16-hour fast, it can help the body improve its ability to recycle and get rid of some of these byproducts that can build up in the body. Now, that is all true, definitely, but it's not without its risks as well. We are hungry humans and we do want to eat food, and our bodies are very intelligent. Sometimes when you fast, you'll find that your body, even if it's not that day, even if it's not the next day, even if it's not even the next week, it will eventually ask for these lost calories. And it can come in the form of binge eating, because ultimately having a fast means that you're probably not going to eat as much in that small window of time that you do eat. So again, everyone's bodies are different. So some people can definitely have all of the calories that they do require within that 8-hour window, for example, if that's the window of fasting time that they so choose to do. And some people, it just doesn't work for them at all, especially if you're working in an office job where you are sitting down and your body is not quite accustomed to the routine of fasting. It's going to ask for these calories eventually, and it can actually make you gain weight. When it comes to fasting and something like breast cancer, there are some really early preliminary studies that are promising, but still much too early to guide any of our nutrition recommendations, where it talks about prolonged fasting and the effect of chemotherapy, in that chemotherapy can work a little bit more effectively. But again, these are very early stage, small group studies, and it doesn't work for everybody. Because, for example, in those situations, whether you are experiencing side effects of something like treatment can really play a part here. If you're already losing weight, we absolutely don't recommend it. We've got to consider pros and cons. When it comes to menopause, it's something that can be helpful for some, but that's only once you've put a lot of your other lifestyle strategies in place. Perhaps they're not working for you and you need something else to trial or test from our toolkit of things to try, but definitely not the first thing to try.
Thank you, Celine. I'll just ask this question just because it is the last one and it relates to the fasting. So very, very briefly, would you advise to still take supplements whilst fasting?
Good question. If you're taking supplements while you are fasting, so during that fasting stage, then you've essentially broken the fast. So I wouldn't recommend it if fasting is something that you are doing, and again, not necessarily recommended for everybody, but if this is something that you are doing, then that would have broken the fast. So any capsules or medications that you do need to take, it's something to consider. But oftentimes they contain calories because they have either a shell that's got some sugar or enteric coated, or like an omega-3 capsule or supplement that's got fat in it, or a vitamin D capsule that's also got fat in it to help you absorb that vitamin D. That's effectively introducing calories into the body. So would do during your eating period rather than the fasting period.
Thank you so much. Okay, so we are just past 7 o'clock. So we will say thank you so much, Celine. That has been incredibly informative. Some thank you messages in the chat that I can see. So thank you so much for your time. We really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.
And just to let everybody know that Celine's recording of tonight's webinar will be emailed out. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.